Great job. All right, so our last speaker for Asia Block number 1 is Yongjae Lee, who will be speaking about the impact of COVID-19 on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on Hong Kong's domestic helpers. All right.
All right. Yes. Can you guys see my screen?
We can, yes.
All right. Hello and welcome to my presentation of the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on Hong Kong's domestic helpers. Before I start my presentation, I would like to introduce to you why I chose this specific research topic. Our first helper basically became like my second mother. And when she had to leave after working for us for 6 years, we sat down and for the first time, I heard her life story. I cried with her, and then from then on, I devoted myself to help domestic helpers in Hong Kong. And recently, I noticed my current helper struggling both financially and mentally. So after giving her some help, I realized that I needed to address this issue, which led me to write on this research paper. So Hong Kong amidst the global pandemic. Hong Kong was one of the first cities to be hit with the pandemic. January 23rd, 2020 was the first confirmed case of COVID-19 in Hong Kong. Then in March 2020, 130,000 citizens were unemployed, a 9-year record high for Hong Kong's unemployment rate. Clearly, the pandemic has both affected the economy and the workforce of Hong Kong. There are more than 400,000 domestic helpers in Hong Kong, 45 of which are Indonesian and 44 of which are Filipino. They also make up around 10% of the working population in Hong Kong. Their jobs include cleaning, feeding the kids and the elderly, picking them up, and much more. Their jobs are all the chores that the mothers of the family has to do. These helpers also came into Hong Kong to support the big families they had back home, since it is a greater advantage for them to come work in Hong Kong, as the same job in the Philippines will only make them around 800 Hong Kong dollars. But in Hong Kong, the same work pays 5 times as much. The domestic helpers has had a huge positive impact on the economy of both Hong Kong and their home country. It is safe to say that the domestic helpers are the backbone to the economy of Hong Kong. They directly contribute around $12.6 billion to Hong Kong's GDP, and their true value of the work that these helpers do for their employers amount to $71.2 billion. Not only that, helpers usually free up significant time for their employers, who in turn contribute around $21.1 billion to Hong Kong's economy. And 110,000 mothers were able to rejoin the workforce in 2018 due to the helpers freeing up a lot of their time. Not only that, domestic helpers send around 50 to 60% of their salary back to their home country, which then supports about 4 to 5 people in their household. In 2018 alone, around $33.7 billion were sent from overseas workers to the Philippines, and around 3% of the money was from domestic workers. However, the domestic workers face hardship when they first arrive in Hong Kong. When they first arrive in Hong Kong, they're actually already in debt. $1,135 to get a job placement in Hong Kong forces them to actually take out loans from these unethical money lending companies, where the interest rate on loans can get as high as 60%. However, the legally permitted placement fee for these domestic helpers are 10% of their first month's salary. Most shockingly, however, the average loan that helpers have to pay is around 11,321 Hong Kong dollars, which is 25 times greater than the legally permitted amount. Even after they pay off these initial payments, they have to remit money to family members for emergency uses such as natural disasters or a family member gets sick. They also tend to remit money for investments or projects such as their kids going to school, or maybe their family started a small company or a shop that they can get other passive incomes from. However, the bottom line is that they have to take more money out to pay for all these needs that they have. And it doesn't help that they live in Hong Kong, where it's the main shopping center of the world, where these helpers who never got to face this much money suddenly has it, and now they can splurge on other luxury goods. 46% of these helpers reported in a survey that they had outstanding loans from a lender in Hong Kong, and they pay around 60% of their salaries in loans installment each month. And 80% of these loans were taken out from money lending companies, which on average give out loans at 12 months duration of 25% per annum. Not only that, they actually face even more hardship because of the global pandemic, especially their habit of loaning from unethical loan companies has gotten worse. Not only that, Hong Kong's domestic workers were actually pushed into debt traps, as many families of the helpers had no income while being under lockdown in their home countries. Most helpers were forced to borrow more money so that their families could stay afloat. This means that they were actually loaning much more than they could afford to. And after this pandemic, they would have to keep working to pay off the debts they have incurred. The pandemic offers around 60% of Hong Kong workers to work from home. This is actually kind of bad for the domestic helpers, as now more of the workers stay home, which increases the workload for the domestic helpers. Half of the helpers in Hong Kong actually had increased workload since the pandemic has started. Also, they don't get rest. 40% of helpers actually never left their residence since the pandemic has hit. During this pandemic, many were mistreated, as around 20% of helpers did not receive their rest day. And one helper even claimed that she had not had a rest day for 9 weeks. And even if they did get rest days, imagining you resting in the same area as your boss. I don't know, but for me, that would just not feel like rest to me. And so would these domestic helpers. And to make matters worse, some helpers were even fired during this pandemic. Just between February and March, the Philippine consul reported that they had assisted 70 displaced Filipino workers, 93% of whom were affected due to the relocation of their employers. Not only that, they only have 2 weeks, according to the law, to either find a new job or go back to their home country. So this 2 week law was actually made so that the employers would get rid of the workers a lot in a faster manner. And this 2 week rule, even without the restricted condition of a pandemic, is really absurd. The Immigration Department of Hong Kong acknowledged in a letter to Amnesty International that processing an application for a change of employer takes around 4 to 6 weeks once all necessary documents are received. So even if the helpers apply for a visa extension costing 160 Hong Kong dollars, the helpers cannot work while they're waiting. Meanwhile, they have to pay for food and shelter, which would just put them more in debt. This is why the word of mouth for employer to employer is so important to the helpers. Since they can't get new employers through the government, they have to get employers from their current employers. And this is why it's very hard for employers to file a complaint against their employer, since if they file a complaint, it becomes a bad reputation for them, which limits them to have other employers sign them. Even if the helpers decide to seek justice through a labor tribunal case, it just takes them around 2 months to get a case prepared, which means that it's just extremely difficult for helpers to seek justice overall in Hong Kong. So how were helpers actually affected by this global pandemic? Before this global pandemic, helpers weren't actually really affected by the 2 week law, since it's actually legally required for the employers to have a 1 month's notice. However, because of the pandemic, it was difficult for employers to give the legally mandated 1 month's notice. And it was nearly impossible for the fired helpers to find a new job because of the 2 week law. And finding a plane ticket back to their home country is harder now than ever before due to travel restrictions. Helpers also have to deal with their housing situations while they're fired, since a hotel is out of the question because it's too expensive, and the housing units offered by agency are often overpriced, 80 Hong Kong dollars per night without any necessity. So they have to buy food and water through their own savings account. Not only that, the Disability Discrimination Ordinance states that it's unlawful to terminate contracts on the ground of any disability, including infectious disease such as COVID-19. However, unions received dozens of complaints who have been fired after falling ill. One story is of a helper named Susan Tin. She arrived in Hong Kong in late February. She felt ill with a stomach problem soon after working in March. She was tested for coronavirus, but she was tested negative. However, her employer insisted that she be quarantined for 2 weeks with no pay, then terminated her contract 3 days later. The employer brought Susan Tin back to her agency when she loudly insulted her and called her a pig. Susan Tin then had to fly back to Indonesia with only $600 in cash. This is one of many examples of what has recently happened in Hong Kong due to the pandemic. Not only that, they were actually hesitant to lodge a complaint with the Equal Opportunities Commission, since, like I mentioned before, it's bad reputation for the helpers and makes it hard for them to get another job in Hong Kong. More shockingly, 80% of helpers in the survey stated that they have faced discrimination during the pandemic, but did not know they could even file a complaint with the EOC. And adding on to this, the EOC has announced that they will ban all their online complaint forms and will only allow complaints filed in person, making it harder for these domestic helpers to actually file the complaints. And on a more serious note, one helper actually committed suicide. And in the note, it read that it was because of the financial and mental struggle of the pandemic, which caused her to do such a sad action. And Lucinda Pike, the executive director of Enrich, one of the leading NGOs in Hong Kong, towards domestic workers stated, when there's a crisis, a lot of people who have low income get left behind the most. And in the case of Hong Kong, that would be the domestic helpers. Relief efforts has been implemented. However, it has not been well implemented by the Hong Kong government, since helpers are ineligible for permanent residency in Hong Kong, which means that they cannot get the compensation packages that the Hong Kong government releases only for their permanent residents. However, the NGOs have stepped in to alleviate some of the stress that these helpers are feeling, such as the NGO mentioned by IYRC. They hosted mental awareness seminars through Zoom and one-to-one financial counseling sessions. Other NGOs has distributed masks and other personal protection equipment. The Filipino-Indonesian government also got involved, the Indonesian government sending around $200 relief packages and distributing around more than 200,000 masks to their helpers. The two governments are trying their best to help the domestic workers out, as they play a vital role in their economies. Before I talk about my solutions, I kind of want to address some limitations I had. Because the corona pandemic has hit only this year, there were very little academic research done on this part of current pandemic affecting the domestic workers. So I had to use previous academic research done on domestic helpers to analyze the situation that domestic helpers would have in this situation. And I also had to use a lot of resources from the media. So one of the first possible solution is the Hong Kong government can be more involved in the issues related to Hong Kong and to the domestic helpers. Since the Labor Department between 2014 and 15 only secured 10 convictions for overcharging of money lending companies and only fined them of less than 10,000 Hong Kong dollars. The government should use more of their power to bring down these illegal agencies and money lending companies so that they can operate again, which causes the domestic helpers to then go to legal companies, which would make them have a better future in Hong Kong. Another solution is the government can extend a 2-week law period for helpers and provide shelters for those in between jobs. The immigration department then can have a lot of time to process the helpers to other employers legally, and allow more time for helpers who have faced discrimination to prepare for labor tribunal cases, so that the employers who has done wrong to the helpers can no longer hire any more domestic helpers. With the government funded shelters, they would actually have they would have less financial stress. It would actually be clean and free, since currently the shelters that are run by churches and nonprofits are very dirty and they don't have any financial aid, which makes the shelters very unclean and bad for the helpers. The Hong Kong government should also provide private spaces for these helpers to rest on their days off while socially distancing and abiding by the appropriate laws. So they can regulate the admitting process, much like the shopping malls in Hong Kong, where they check your temperature before you go in, always have a mask, and all these rules. And not only that, it actually gives them a place for them to rest, which I mentioned before is a big problem that these helpers are having, since they don't have time to rest. And the Hong Kong government can actually benefit from this, as they can test the helpers with higher temperatures for COVID-19, which then can limit the infection of the COVID-19 through the helpers, then onto the Hong Kong community. Thank you. That's all for my presentation.
All right, thank you so much, Yongjae. Do we have any questions about his research? So I have a question. You proposed 3 possible solutions. Which of the 3 do you think is most likely to actually be enacted, if any?
I kind of divided this in 2 terms. Like for the temporary and like the immediate solution, I feel like possible solution number 3, where the government provide private spaces for the helpers, would be the most beneficial, since it both helps the helpers and the government. But solution number 2, where they extend the 2-week law period, would be the most beneficial in the long term, since if they actually extend the 2-week law and provide shelters with government funded shelters, then it would just help the helpers overall, in the sense that they can not only get justice, but they can also have they can relieve a lot of more stress that they usually would have.
Thank you. Any
Thank
other
you.
questions from the audience? All right. If not, I want to thank all of our speakers from Asia Block 1 for their hard work. Some really fascinating presentations and certainly some things to think about.